Okay, folks, welcome back to another episode of It Takes a Village podcast. A story about somebody who has been in the industry for approximately 30 years in the media industry, somebody who you have probably seen across the screen on TSN specifically. He's covered everything from NHL finals, NBA playoffs, CFL Grey Cups, Super Bowls, you name it. He is also inducted into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame, and he's also an ambassador for kids and youth in sport and a longtime football coach at New West Secondary. Mr. Farhan Lalji, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. And I do want to let all your viewers know that, how I feel a connection to you as your father, because he was my sixth grade teacher at Brantford Elementary in Burnaby. And he had a real impact. You don't remember all your teachers, but I remember him. We used to think in the sixth grade he was the coolest guy ever because him and his brother had some time with the Whitecaps and everything like that. And we said, oh, we got athletes teaching us. And so we thought he was the man in the sixth grade. So you were lucky to have him as a dad growing up. I'm sure he'll love to hear this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Every time you pop on the screen, he's like, "Oh, you know what? I taught that guy." It's like, well, you know what? I got to reach out to him and see if he'll come on. But you've been somebody that we've our family's been following for many years. A huge success story, local talent. So why don't we just get into Farhan Lalji? This is your story. Can you tell our viewers, your who you are and how you came to be?
Wow, that's a big question. I'm getting old. I'm 57. From Africa. Moved from Tanzania to Canada when I was 4 years old, and just regular kid after that. Growing up, once I kind of figured some things out, played a ton of sports as a kid. Eventually found my passion, which was football. Managed to kind of stay in that my entire life. Got into the television side, had to make some decisions early on about in terms of what I wanted for a career path, whether I wanted it to involve football or wanted it to involve television. And, things went the way they did. And I'm a father of two. I've got a 17-year-old son. I've got a 14-year-old daughter. I've got a wonderful wife, and I'm just enjoying every minute I can around my kids' activities because I know I'm kind of coming to the end of all of this. And just trying to be as present as possible. But that's the bulk of it. 30 years as a high school football coach. I'm still on the board of directors of BC High School football, but trying to be a father more than anything right now.
That's amazing. And you've had a ton of accomplishments. You're all over social media. Can you define success from your lens?
It's a good question. I don't know that I've achieved it yet. I think for me, success, people want to say, okay, well, you work for TSN, which is the top of the industry as far as Canadian sports television is concerned. And I guess that's one measurement of success. And I appreciate the opportunities that I've had just to have a career that I do and getting a chance to cover the events that I cover all over the world. I don't have the same day twice. I don't have to go into an office and check in and do all of those kinds of things. I don't view my job as a job. I view it as fun. But, their success can be measured in a lot of other ways, right? For me, because you want to be a good husband, you want to be a good father. People measure success financially. I don't know that, I've hit the goals I want to measure that level of success. But, I feel like I've impacted people on the coaching side, and I feel like I've made a difference in a number of lives, and I view that as a success. So there's a lot of different metrics you can use, and I think I'm successful in some areas, and I think I'm pretty average in others.
So let's talk about your actual career working for TSN. It's such a unique job or career. I had Donovan Bennett on recently, and Tim McAuliffe is planning to come on, and I'm so intrigued about the media side of things. It's a role that not many people get to do. Undoubtedly, there has to be some challenges or obstacles in the last 3 decades. Can you put a finger on some?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest obstacle at the front end was it wasn't something I ever planned on. And I never went to broadcast school. I majored in communications at Simon Fraser, and I thought eventually I would get into PR and that side of things. And one of the reasons is that I just nobody looked like me, and you didn't know that those opportunities were going to come back then in the 90s, in the early 90s. And not only that, the industry was very closed, and the people that were there had been there forever, and they didn't look like they were leaving anytime soon. And so you didn't think there would be opportunities from that perspective. And I didn't want to be one of those guys that had to go live in a tiny town somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and eventually, if they were lucky, work their way back. Um, So I wound up being after university, I wound up being the sports information director at Simon Fraser for 3 years, and from there, I just met a lot of people and wound up networking my way into an opportunity. So at the front end, there were some challenges again, just because I just didn't know the opportunity would be there for a number of reasons. Um, Currently, I think the biggest challenges are what's happening to the industry, right? Because the internet, which was barely there when I first started, is completely revolutionized everything. You know, the advice I would give to young people who wanted to get into the industry 20 years ago versus people who want to get into the industry now, it's entirely different. And I'm not, I might be on social media, but I'm not necessarily an influencer or social media sensation, right? I think I barely have 4,000 Instagram followers, which compared to other people, you got to have 50, 60,000.
Mhm.
So I feel like I'm still of the vintage of being a sportscaster, as opposed to now everybody's looking for content creators
Mm.
and multi-platform, people who can do that. And I can do that to a point. I don't know that I can necessarily do that to the point that others do. But so I think those are the challenges, and it's just trying to stay relevant in an industry that is moving 100 miles an hour, and it is moving at hyperspeed. The last 5 to 7 years have been entirely different than the first 20 years I had in the industry.
Mm. And can you target some of those changes? Like, I know you mentioned, like, social media and internet. Is it personality? I mean, you have such a unique voice and presence. Do you need that to be successful in this industry?
Well, people talk about how to be successful on social media versus media, and it's just a constant presence, and it's
Mhm.
delivering constant content. And I don't always think in those terms, like I've got some corporate partners that I work with, and I basically tell them, I said, look, I am here to represent your brand, but in terms of creating the content, you guys have got to determine what you want that to look like. I'll execute it,
Mhm.
but you probably need the creative for what you want for your business, right? And then I can help you deliver that, right? So it's just different. Like I don't have that um ability to constantly creatively create content, right? And in ways that everything is bite-sized, and in ways that a 20-year-old wants to consume, right? Like my kids have no interest in watching what I do.
Mm.
Sometimes they see it, but it's not their jam, because it's just not how they watch TV. And the industry has become so fragmented because now you've got streaming services. It's not all cable anymore, right? And it's so weird because when you look at how it's evolved, you can buy all these different streaming packages. Boy, that sure feels like cable, doesn't it? Right? Like you could put it all together and get the channels that you want. To just feels like cable, but you're paying and you're doing it this way. So it's changed so much, and you just wonder, because even some for me, when I work for TSN, there are times that I will travel somewhere, and only a small percentage of my content makes it to Sports Center.
Mhm.
Some of it will just live on social media, and our
Mm.
network makes those decisions, and we provide additional content. Like I'll go to um, if I'm covering a Stanley Cup playoff game or an NFL playoff game, I'll do my, quick stuff for Sports Center, but then I'll sit there and I'll riff on something significantly longer that could then live on YouTube, right?
Mhm.
Well, there's a certain level of rawness to that. Sometimes you want a level of production to it, so it changes, and um, it's an effort to keep up for sure.
And I want to, for the theme of the podcast, it takes a village. I mentioned earlier that you're a longtime football coach. You're an
Yeah.
ambassador for kids and youth in sport. You're obviously paying it forward to others, inspiring others. And I think indirectly, just through your work on TSN, you've inspired others to get into the industry. Let's get into kind of the youth and kind of your support through football. Is that your main way of paying it forward to others? Like if someone is to do research on your name, you've helped a lot of students get on to the next level from high school.
Yeah, that's just kinda how it's evolved for sure, paying it forward and volunteering and trying to make an impact and make the lives of others better has always mattered to me. I think that came fairly naturally. There's different ways to do that, but it started for me. I played every sport, eventually kind of gravitated to football, and when I got to high school, my high school football coach, became a real mentor to me.
Mm,
And when high school finished for me, I primarily got into coaching because I wanted to be around him, right? It wasn't necessarily the coaching. Like I loved the sport, but I wanted to stay connected to him. I didn't want to lose his influence in my life. So I started getting into coaching just so I could, be around it, be around the sport, be around him. And then it just kind of went from there. And I just found my calling. So I coached for a number of years, and he and I coached together from, I want to say like I graduated in '86, and in '87, while I was playing junior football, I began coaching, and then I coached with him until '99, and then in 2003 he retired, and then in 2003 I decided I wanted to start my own football program because that was something he did, right?
Hmm.
And I had been on the board of BC High School football, and I was a fairly respected figure in the
Hmm.
community, and was starting to do things provincially, create the provincial all-star awards banquet, put the games on, get the games on national television, the championship games, create a media package. I started doing all of these things, and then I kind of felt like I was losing the other piece, which was the day-to-day interaction with the kids. I was helping as an assistant coach elsewhere, but I wasn't making a difference. So I decided that I wanted to start my own program. And at the time, I had other people come to me and saying, "Why don't you take over my program?" And I talked to my wife about it, my fiance at the time, and she's like, "No, don't take over someone else's program. Start your own thing. Like,
Hmm.
don't clean up someone else's mess." And my old coach started the program at Burnaby Central where I played. So I thought, okay, well, if he did that, I should do that.
Hmm.
Um, and so I started my own program, and it was, other than being a father, it's probably the most rewarding thing I've ever done.
Hmm.
And just to see something go from idea to reality to championship to an entire community being involved, and to have a vision and see that vision, work itself into reality in a big way, like not just putting a team on the field,
Hmm.
but the impact we were able to make in the community. Like I can't um, say enough good things about the experience that was, and the people that worked with me to make that happen. So it was great, and the kids sport thing started there because I had some friends that were kids sport ambassadors, and then I helped launch the kids sport chapter in New Westminster. And football, more than any other sport, in my opinion, really, really does everything it can to keep costs down, right?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
there's privatization of sports, which is a completely different conversation.
Hmm.
But, we know how much hockey costs. But in football, we provide the equipment, and we do everything we can to eliminate costs. So, and one of the reasons is that football lends itself to at-risk kids. It
Yeah.
lends itself to immigrants. It lends itself to late entry people, right? That have, maybe it hasn't worked out for them in hockey, and by the time they're 13, they realize, and football lends itself to guys joining late. So kids sport really makes a difference in football, where it might be a drop in the bucket in a big, in a
Hmm.
sport like hockey, which gets so expensive. So I started doing that, and now I'm on the national board of directors for Kids Sport Canada, and rewarding, like it gets a little corporate, and you're dealing
Hmm.
with government, which isn't necessarily the fun part of
Yeah.
working
Yeah.
with kids, but you do see the difference that that entity makes. So, sport has just been a constant in my life, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
And you were at New West for a very long time coaching. Can you pinpoint, maybe one of the highlights running that program?
Um, a lot of people will look back and they'll talk about us winning the provincial championship in 2017, and that was great. But honestly, it was some of the other work that we were able to do, which becomes so hard to do in education today because of the bureaucracy involved. And
Hmm.
like, we had like drug testing policies in our program and things like that. And I used to create a scared straight program for some of my kids. One of my coaches um, was a sheriff, but like he was in charge of the sheriffs down at one of the law courts, right? And so if there were some kids that I knew were doing the wrong things, I would go through a process where I would get their parents to sign off, and I would get them drug tested, and I would take them down to the jail on a welfare Wednesday. And we would go through, and like the sheriff would get the guys that were literally in jail he would tell them what was happening, and they would try to scare the crap out of these kids. And then we would go meet a judge, and like we did some things that forced kids to really look at themselves. And when those kids would come back and say to me that you have no idea what you did, and how much of a difference it made. And I didn't have a father that was in my life. My parents were split, and that made a difference. Like those for me are the wins, and I think that winning a championship, the first one in 2017 was fun, but all it did was tell me that all the other things that I always said I was doing it for, that
Hmm.
that was true.
Hmm.
Like you finally win it, and the kids get to celebrate at the end of the year instead of crying at the end of the year. And you
Hmm.
think that that's the euphoric moment, but it really wasn't. It like that moment just allowed me to realize that everything else was equally important, right? So that revelation mattered a lot to me, and just those kids coming back and seeing the difference that our program made, because it wasn't just me. Like you couldn't do what we did without so many resources and so many other people buying into it.
A great segue into my next question for you, which I know you're very knowledgeable on. You've been on other podcasts, even talking to this point. But what does sport do for our youth today? Is it essential for their growth?
I think it's really important, and I think that the role of sport is evolving, and I think the role of parents in sports needs to evolve as well. And I'm sure that's the show that you're referring to, but I think sport is so important for developing confidence. I think it's important for developing teamwork. I think it's important for developing friendship, right? Because where it started for me was as an immigrant kid. That was the common language, right? Like when I moved here and I was 4, I spoke with an accent, right? And
Hmm. Hmm.
and you're still learning the language. And for me, just the opportunity to just make friends, because when we all kick a ball, it's the same language. When we
Hmm.
all shoot a puck, it's the same language. So, you know, I think that was instrumental, and the teamwork and knowing that everybody has a different role and finding value in your role. Not everybody can be the star quarterback. Sometimes you're going to be a lineman. Sometimes you're going to be a backup. All of those types of things. You've got to find validity in that. It's incumbent on coaches to give validity to all of those roles. Um, but there's the recreational aspect of sports, and there's playing, and then there's the competitive side of it. And I do think competition is important. I think it's important for kids to set goals and try to reach them. But, within all of that, there are other unintended consequences that people need to be aware of. And in my journey as a coach, but also in my journey as a parent, I've seen every side of it. And it's really important that parents, before they get started at this, really, really think about what they want it to look like for their children. Because, you know, I'm sure you've been through this. Like, your kid is born, and you just so look forward to the day you can play catch with them, and then you so look forward to the day you can watch them play. But then what, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then when they want to get competitive, or do you want them to get competitive? Like, what's all of that going to look like? What's the messaging going to look like? And the sport has changed so much, right? Like youth sport has changed so much, and it's not all for the better.
Hmm.
And so the parent role in it and the coach role in it is really, really important.
Yeah, it's my daughter's 6, and we just put her into basketball, and with some really qualified and distinguished coaches, just camps that they run every Tuesday night. So we go and she's just learning the game. But there are parents there that are super competitive, and it's 6-year-old basketball. I just want my daughter to learn how to dribble, pass, and shoot and communicate, like you said. But it's pretty mind-boggling the amount of people that think that this is the start of maybe all stardom and their
Yeah.
journey to being great. Kind of leading to the next piece, we don't have to talk about it too long because I know we've, as a collective, as being as coaches and educators, we beat this thing to death. Just your quick thoughts on current role of sport, youth in sport, high school sports versus club. Are we worried? Are we trending in the wrong direction?
I think so. Yeah, I do. Privatization of sport for me is an issue, right? And I understand that that's where the best coaches are. And wouldn't it be great if the school system understood that if we paid our coaches within the school system, they'd be able to impact so many more people, right? And I've done it for 30 plus years and I've never been paid, and it wouldn't change how I approached it.
Hmm.
And that's just me, but I grew up in a different era around people that thought like I did and was mentored by people that thought like I did, but now it's changed. So if we could find a way to provide some funding or some sort of benefit for people to do this when they're in the school system, you would impact more kids, because
Hmm.
basketball is a real example of this, because there's a real concern in basketball about the club system taking over from high school basketball. And that would be an incredible shame, because if
Hmm.
you look at the BC High School basketball championships, club sport can't provide something like that.
Yeah.
It just can't,
Yeah.
because there's no school communities or larger communities that are going to want to support something like that. It's just
Mhm.
not going to happen. And
Mhm.
think of the kids that are marginal players that might have an opportunity to be really good high school players, but they're never going to advance in the club system, right? Or the elite system or the academy system. So many of those kids wind up washing out, right? Like, I've been around so many kids that if they kind of went through a certain path, and then if they didn't make a specific team in hockey, didn't want to play house anymore. So what you're telling me is you don't really love the game, right? Like, you've been programmed to do it in such a way that when it's done and you didn't achieve a certain goal, you're still 15 and you're ready to be done with it. Like, that's wild to me. Like, you
Mhm.
loved this sport. You loved skating, shooting, scoring, passing, being a teammate. All of those things can still exist in house hockey, but we've conditioned these kids to go in a certain way. And then all of a sudden, if they don't get to their level because they were too small or too whatever, now they just want to tap out of the sport entirely, and that's a
Mhm.
shame. So,
Yeah.
and there's differences between club and privatization. It's not all things are created equal, but
Mhm.
those terms like academy and elite and things like that are dangerous, dangerous terms because they don't always apply.
Yeah, I agree. In my world of education, when I first started 16 years ago, I was I would do anything to get a job and then also throw my name in the hat to coach something. Fast forward to 2026, especially through COVID, we've kind of lost a lot of those teacher coaches who are willing to give up those your time, kind of like what you have done for decades. There's a real concern for especially the education side of things because you learn a lot of those skills, learning how to communicate, make decisions under pressure with some of your teammates, right? And then it's kind of sad to see, and I'm hoping it swings the other way, but I just don't know if I don't know how to
I don't
change
know.
that. Yeah,
Well, there needs to be a
yeah,
drastic change. So you look at the federal government in the last couple of weeks has decided to contribute a lot more money into the sports system. And, we're like at Kids Sport, we're looking at ways to kind of access some of that funding as our groups across the country. And I think that's great. But I, I really, really believe the school system is the missing piece.
mm,
So the hardest thing for me when I was a coach and we were trying to get people hired was, if you're a principal, you couldn't hire somebody based on a sport. You couldn't even ask them in the interview if they were willing to coach because that was a union violation, right?
hmm,
Because they're
hmm,
not being paid for that, so they're not being hired based on that.
hmm,
So somehow or another, with the unions and with the provincial governments, and maybe it starts at the federal level, but we need to find a way to compensate these people.
hmm,
Maybe you make sport curricular. Maybe you offer kids or teachers more spares if you can't necessarily hire them for that, right? There's got to be a way to put value on what these coaches are doing and incentivize them to stay involved because when I was at New West, like, it was virtually a completely volunteer run athletic department. Like, our athletic director was a prince, like an amazing guy, but all he was doing was plugging dikes, trying to get different volunteers to coach different sports because very few staff were doing it, right?
hmm, hmm.
And that's a common thread across the province, and it's not just a football thing. Where it
Yeah.
hurts in football is the number of coaches you actually need. So we need to find ways to do that. Like, it became so difficult for a principal, even if they were motivated, and you're an administrator, to get anything done in that vein. And it's got to start at the top because you can't blame the unions, you can't blame the provincial government, but collectively, there's got to be a way to put a value on this. Is because every time, you sit there and you go through a job action and you go through a strike, and in the end, you just try to wind back to what you had before, as opposed to making actually any gains in labor negotiations. And it's a tough place to be, man. Like, my kids go to school just across the line in Washington, and the things we cut in BC, they would never contemplate cutting down there. And the
Mm,
teachers, even the middle school coaches, get paid
mm,
$1,000 to be a middle school assistant coach. That's crazy. It's not life changing money, but
yeah.
for that coach, it gives them a value. My job, my work here is being valued. Let's make that effort.
And so I'm curious, does that number increase as the age gets older? So by say your senior years, is that coaching getting paid more?
Sure. Yeah. The
Yeah.
longer you've coached, the more you get paid. The
Mm,
higher level you coach at, the more you get paid. And teaching course loads are built around who the main coaches are in the school, right? Like, if you were the head coach of one of the high time consuming sports, right? The footballs, the basketballs, um, your teaching course load reflects the fact that this is what you're doing, right? And that's kind of how it should be. There was a time when the coaches got the phys ed classes,
Yeah.
right? Even in British Columbia, that
Yeah.
wasn't law. That was just understood.
Hmm.
You know, one of my coaching mentors was a guy named Kevin Chin, and Kevin coached football for a long time. Passed away in, I want to say 2008. Kevin was a teacher in Coquitlam, and he was a coach in Coquitlam, and he decided to step down from coaching, and then he sent his kids to play to come to school at New West. It was a French immersion school. His wife was French. They wanted football and French immersion, so they played for me at New West. And then he would come over, a school teacher in Coquitlam. He would come and be a volunteer coach for me at New West while his kids were there. Well, when he did that, he gave up all his phys ed courses.
Hmm.
Like, who would do that? Tell
Right.
me a phys ed coach that would do that today. But he understood that the coaches in the school got the phys ed blocks because the prep was easier,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So he taught different classes because he was no longer coaching at that school. That's just not how teachers are wired today.
Hmm. Very interesting models going from just across a line, 10-minute drive, right? And it's completely different. I want to kind of get into the student athlete side of things. You've seen an array of athletes across multiple sports. What separates a kid to get to the next level versus one that, might just want to play the house?
Consistency. I think that's the biggest thing. The kid that is willing to constantly work, the kid that's willing to work when no one's watching, the kid that's willing to do sprints in the rain, the kid that, when he's just not feeling it, finds a way to get there,
Mm,
right? Um, that's the kid, and there's less and less of that, right? But like when I look at a kid and I think they're going to make it to the next level, it's not because they're gifted. Because sometimes a kid just happens to be ahead. You talk to me about your 6-year-old playing basketball. The advice I would give a parent of a 4-year-old is like teach them physical literacy, teach them movement skills, put them in things that teach that, like gymnastics or just running and things like that, because that'll get that kid ahead. But it's his work ethic that'll get him to the next level. His discipline, his consistency to want to work. That's what's going to get him to the higher level. That's what's going to get him the scholarship. The kid that's just kind of floating around and just happens to be good or happens to be ahead, there's a
mhm.
ceiling on that kid.
Yeah, I like that. I asked the same question to, I just had Savannah Graywall on, and she's a Canadian LPGA golfer, 24 years old, went to Clemson New, and just shattered records at the school. And I think in her first ever LPGA event, she came top five. And she's doing very well. But I asked her the same question, and she said, and I kind of framed it. And I said, is it sacrifices? She goes, not sacrifices. It's my choice that I didn't want to go to, say, grad events, but I had to put in 4 or 5 hours a day at the range. I had to be on the putting green for 2 hours a day, and that's just what it took to get to the next level. So I appreciate you saying that, because kind of like what you say, I think kids, and maybe I'm misreading it, but I feel like kids are easy to give up if they don't see success, or they're getting to, that elite team, or et cetera, et cetera. But are you finding, last question's about the kids, but are you finding kids giving up easy these days?
Yeah, yeah, I think
Yeah.
there's a lot more of that, and I think that's society, and we've conditioned them, and we want to, I don't like using snowflake type terms, but there is a lot of that we feel, in an era of mental health awareness. I think there's a feeling of let's not put too much pressure on these kids,
Mm,
right? And um, ultimately, I think the kids got to make those decisions themselves. Parents shouldn't be pressuring kids, but kids have to decide themselves. Like you talked about making choices, right? And the golfer that you were talking about making choices. The kid that doesn't view it as a choice is the kid that's most likely to advance, because then they don't view it as sacrifice, right? I just love this. This is what I do, and I'm just going to do it. And there's less and less of that because there's a lot of stuff in front of our kids, right? Like we didn't grow up with phones, and phones aren't evil, and it's not just a kid problem because adults use phones all the time and can get addicted and see validation in other things.
yeah.
But there's just a lot of distraction in front of kids, and it makes it harder for them to be consistent, like I talked about with the other question. So, yeah, I mean, like we talk about how we grew up and the social skills that were gained. It's harder for those skills to be gained now, and we didn't have as many distractions. We didn't have as many choices as what these kids have now, and sometimes they just don't make the ones that are going to lend itself to athletic success.
we've covered a lot about kids. I kind of want to circle back to Farhan here and your experience as a sportscaster, storyteller. You've covered some of the biggest events on the world stage. What separates a great story from a good one? Maybe I'll reframe that as like, what determines a great story?
Well, I think there's a lot of different things, right? Y it's sometimes it's, the biggest athlete. Sometimes it's the up and coming athlete that you never heard of. Sometimes it's an athlete that got knocked down either through injury or failure and found a way to rise back up, and generally, those things all kinda happen on the big stage. Excellence can lead itself to great stories, you know? Um, it's hard to kind of finger one thing, but it's really important that the athlete be the story, right? The journalist can't be the story.
Hmm.
And so I find myself in my industry doing a lot of listening. I try really hard when I interview athletes to listen and ask questions that will give them a moment to think, right, before they answer. But I remember having one athlete. I was doing a sit down interview with him, and he said, "How come you don't have notes?" Right? And I said, "Well, I mean, I prepared in advance. I do know what I wanted to talk about." I said, "But I would like to listen to what you have to say. It's your story. So you're gonna answer, and that answer is gonna give me the next question." Right? So that I don't want you to say something that's so obvious and I missed it in an effort to get to my next question because I had all this stuff written down. So I think it's important that the athlete be the story. And I've had a chance to cover, like Usain Bolt setting a world record at the Olympics, and Michael Jordan's last shot as a member of the Bulls. When he hit that shot and kind of held the pose
Hmm.
to win the championship before he retired. Like there's been a lot of those kinds of moments, but and so different things in those two cases. Those are two of the greatest athletes in the history of their sport, if
Hmm.
not the greatest in the history of their sport. So those stories kind of write themselves. But then there's others that it just didn't work out for. A lot was put on them, and it just didn't work out, and you wanna see how they kinda rise back up and work their way through it.
Speaking of athletes, is there a story that you covered that changed how you view athletes or sports in general?
There was not a story, but a moment, which I've told before. I was at the 2012 Olympics in London, and I was on the broadcast crew for track and field, which is a big passion of mine. And we had this area for just the rights holders. You each kind of got your own square, and the athletes came by you, and they went to the rights holders first before they went to the other media. And at one point before Bolt's, I think, semifinal race in the 100, I looked over to my left, and Kobe Bryant was there. He was getting into a bit of an argument with the person that was running our area. Right? And they had no idea who Kobe Bryant was. They just saw his credentials and realized, and just like, you're an athlete, you're not supposed to be here. So I went to that person who I'd kind of developed a bit of a relationship with, and I said, like, this is probably like the best basketball player in the world. Like, you need to let him in, and he can stay in my space. And the guy's like, "Oh, really?" I said, "Yeah, you don't want to be the one turning him away." So he was with me, and we had a mutual acquaintance, and I kind of dropped his name. And he had remembered me from previous interviews, but didn't really know me, but he knew this other person. So that kind of, took a bit of a barrier down. And he just wanted to watch Bolt run
Mm.
and when he watched the race, the awe in Kobe Bryant's eyes and the reaction to him watching Bolt stretch out and expand his lead and take this was really cool to me, right? Just watching arguably the world's best watch the world's best and be in awe and be impressed. And you
Wow.
you realize that he's just like one of us in that moment, right? So it wasn't necessarily a story, but it was a moment. And then I was able to put the camera on him and ask him a little bit about it. And it was cool, right? So yeah, that was probably one of them. There's, you know, yeah, I think that's the first one that comes to mind for sure.
Now I got to ask you, like, who is your favorite person that you've ever ran into, interviewed, had time with?
Truly, it would probably be the Sedin twins. Um, and again, there have been some great people that have had a chance to talk to. I mentioned Usain Bolt, so engaging, welcoming. It was great to talk to him when I did. Um, you know, Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, those types of players were great, and certainly football's my thing. But the Sedin twins, and I say that just because they are the classiest individuals I've ever been around. Right, the way they conducted themselves, the way they treated us. The way they went from two guys who you just never thought were going to make it in this league. Like when those two guys first came into the league and you'd see them in the locker room without their shirt on, like they had some bad bodies. And
Mm,
when you saw them by the end and they were running marathons and
yeah.
coming in with the best fitness testing available or possible for the Canucks and just the professionalism that they constantly carried themselves with, um, it was good. And, in my business, you get to a point where relationships and working conditions and things like that matter, right? Like you don't want to be around people that are difficult, even if they're the greatest, right? Like that's just not my jam anymore. I've done this for a long time. I want to be able to talk to guys, have some mutual respect, and you know, just yeah, like I think those things matter. So those two were head and shoulders the athletes that I enjoyed being around the most and talking to the most.
And I'm sure you get this from all angles. Like I can only imagine what your phone's doing on a daily basis. The amount of people that you have to report to or check in with. You're such a public figure. What keeps you grounded in this industry?
My family,
Yeah,
like I said, my kids have no interest in what I do.
yeah.
So I'm just dad. My wife's the same way. She's not a huge professional sports fan. Even the kids that I coached, truly for years and years, right? Like they would come into our program, know who I was, and think this was amazing.
Right.
And then, like,
Yeah.
after the first day where I made you condition, that all went away, right? And now I was just your coach. And I developed, really good relationships with the majority of kids, but, you know, they ground you because then you learn about their lives and their stories and sometimes their struggle and things like that, right? So that kind of puts perspective, what's important in life. And so I think those things and then with my kids going to school in Linden, I spend time down there and, even though we still live in New West, and they have no idea, right? Like they have no idea. I got inducted into uh, either the BC or the Canadian Football Hall of Fame last year. There was kind of two that happened within a month, and we had a party at a place in New West, and three of my friends from Linden came up.
Mhm.
And I was shocked to see them, but they were shocked at what they saw, right? And the number of people that were there and they're like, holy, like you truly have a different life. And then a couple weeks ago, my daughter's track coach put out a note saying, hey, we need volunteers. So I went there and I said, hey, like I can help. What do you need me to do? And she said, well, you can run one of the events if you'd like, or if you're comfortable, you could maybe be the PA announcer. I don't know how you feel about doing something like that. Right. And so I said, yeah, I think I can handle it. I told the athletic director the story and he knew what I did for a living. He couldn't stop laughing. So there's moments like that keep you grounded.
Yeah, shoe in for sure, right there.
Yeah.
Okay, last question for a bit of your insight. I often think that sports can reflect society. What are we learning about ourselves as a collective through sport?
Wow, that's a good question. Like I worry about civility in society as a reflection of kind of what we're seeing in the United States since 2016. And we know what happened in 2016,
Hmm.
right? And just to me, and I spend a lot of time there, both for work and with my kids, and I see differences. Like the world has changed, and I just I don't want to see that bleed into sport, and I think it does to a degree.
Hmm.
I think people treat each other differently and talk to each other differently, and there's a different standard for what's acceptable. And sometimes that happens off the field; doesn't necessarily happen in game, but it still happens with how people are treated. Because sometimes what wasn't okay before, the quiet part is now able to be said out loud. So there's things like that. I just don't want to see that societal change in the last decade weave its way into something as pure as sport because sport has enough problems with the privatization side of sport and what that is doing to kids and eliminating kids and barriers that are being put up where sport was meant to take barriers down. I just want to see civility remain in sport or be accentuated in sport, right? Like I
Yeah.
don't yeah, that's probably the main thing.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Just cognizant of time here, a couple of rapid fire questions for you. Who is the athlete that surprised you the most in your travels?
um the athlete that surprised me the most, boy, that's a tough one. Um, that is a tough Shaq.
Shaq?
I had like this vision of Shaq as this, big brooding, angry man all the time because of how he kind of presented himself when he first came into the league. But then spending time with him, like, and not that I know him, personally, but getting a chance to interview him and be around him a bunch later in his career, just the enjoyment he tried to have, and just like the fact that he was a kid, I think that really surprised me. Yeah, that's probably the one. Just him being a really big kid, especially later in his career.
Is there an athlete out there that you haven't had a chance to interview or chat with that you would like to?
Probably not. If
No?
I hate to say that,
Yeah.
I know that sounds bad, but there's not necessarily a bucket list athlete, just because I've had a chance to interview Kobe, LeBron, Jordan, name the hockey player, name the Mahomes, Brady, Manning. Like, I've had a chance to do all of that, so I don't know that there's a bucket list. Although I will say this, I'm looking forward to covering the World Cup. Now, I'm not a big soccer guy,
Mm.
but I understand the magnitude of the event, and I've never covered it. And early in my career, I got a chance to cover the World Cup in Germany, and I turned it down because I
Oh.
had done the Stanley Cup playoffs and I'd gone right from there to the NBA Finals, and I was tired and I didn't want to travel anymore. And I
Mm.
remember, um, it might have been later that summer. I wound up going to Germany with my wife, who is half German. And so we went and spent a bunch of time on these farms all over Germany where her family lives. And I tried to explain this to my in-laws, and they thought it was the craziest thing they'd ever heard, that I would turn down a chance to cover the World Cup,
Yeah, yeah.
which was in Europe at the time. And so I've never done it. Again, I've never been a big soccer guy. I covered the MLS Cup, the final last year in Miami, and I've spent a bit of time here and there covering the Whitecaps. Um, and you want to talk about engaging athletes? Let me tell you something. Thomas Muller, holy cow! Like, that guy might be like in Sedin territory,
Yeah,
but even more engaging because he's just so unassuming and funny, right? Like, he just laughs a lot, right?
yeah.
Um,
And he's got a huge following too, right?
that
Yeah,
guy is a dude. Like, just having him in our market in Vancouver, like, he is awesome. And
yeah.
I could say I would be surprised. You asked me about an athlete that surprises me. I just had no idea. I mean, I knew who he was by name, but I had no expectations of him because I just don't follow soccer enough to have an opinion on a certain guy's personality. He
Mhm.
was awesome.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
you always think of Germans as these serious people. I joked with him about the Beck's commercial. Germans don't do romance, they do beer, from like 15 years ago. And I had to explain it to him. Yeah, so he was definitely not that guy. He was a funny, engaging guy. But I'm looking forward to covering the World Cup, just as an event I've never had a chance to do. And I've done the Olympics, I've done the Super Bowls, the NBA Finals, the Stanley Cup, the Grey Cup, all those things, World Series. That one I want to do.
Yeah, that's exciting. I'm
And
happy.
if I had an athlete that he's pretty much retired now, but Roger Federer,
Oh yeah, how come?
yeah, just because he exudes class and was such a champion, just defined success. And I don't know if you ever saw it. He has this post which I think is the best thing I've ever seen on Instagram, and I actually have shown it to my kids, that just explains the difference between winning and losing. And he talked about all the championships and all the matches and everything like that he's won, but he's only won 55 or 56% of his points in his entire
Mm,
career, which is
interesting.
fascinating to me, that he's won such a few percentage of points, but yet he's won all these massive tournaments and matches. And his point was that I had the ability to move on to the next point. So it's not how many points you won, it's that you won the important points. And I had the ability to move on from this, to reset myself and get to that. And that's how I was able to succeed. And I could just imagine that he would be, like a walking TED talk, or, in
Totally.
terms of athletic performance. So I've never had a chance to interview Roger Federer.
That's cool. Okay, best advice that you have ever received.
Being right is not always right. Um, and this applies everywhere, and it probably applies more away from sport than it does to sport, right? Like, if you are finding yourself in an argument with your wife and you are convinced you're right, being right might not be the best thing for you. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
you might want to just apologize, take the mulligan, and move
yeah,
it along.
yeah. Take your
And
medicine for sure.
I had this conversation with a colleague of mine early in my career at TSN, where he thought I was kind of getting a little big for my britches. This was like in the '90s, right? And I totally didn't think I was. Like I was having some early success and he thought I was kind of getting ahead of myself. And he called me in and he says, listen, this person had this conversation with me and I'm doing you a favor by having this conversation with you. And I wanted to tell him, you're an idiot. Like you are wrong. And here's thus and so and things that I've done to tell you that I'm wrong. But I didn't. It was my first glimpse of maturity. And I just had this revelation in my mind that, you know what, if he feels this way and others in the building feel this way, then whether I'm behaving this way or not, I need to make it right. Even if I don't think I'm wrong, I need to just take a step back, change how I'm behaving. And because I've always considered myself humble in an industry that doesn't lend itself to that, and maybe I'm not, but I feel that way about myself. I changed. Like I just made an effort to ask people more about themselves and just be nicer, say thank you, whatever it took, right? But I could have fought back in that conversation. And instead, I thought, this is not, you can't be right here. And so I've kind of carried that over into later stages. I've tried to express that to my kids. My daughter's 14. When you're a 14-year-old girl, you are always right.
Yeah,
Like you were
totally.
always right. And eventually she'll learn and she'll kind of come around, but being right is not always right.
I love that. Um, Specifically for your industry, what advice would you give for up and coming or people who want to become a broadcaster, journalist, etc.?
Probably what we talked about earlier, right? Like, don't try to be a journalist, try to be a content provider, try to be a content creator. But I'm not talking about somebody who's fluffy on social media all the time. And maybe that's what you want to do. And if that's going to make you money, great. But if you value journalism, I think that you need to be true to that. Be true to the story. Ask questions. Don't be afraid and listen. I remember this years ago. I used to work at SFU, and Allison McNeil, the former women's basketball coach, her office was across the street from mine. Sorry, across the hall from mine. And she had a sign on her door that said, 270 some odd universities offer degrees in communications. Only 7 of them offer courses in listening. And made me think, right? So, you know, listen, be true to journalism. Like it's very difficult in today's day and age because I've never seen the media this polarized, especially in the United States. Like
Hmm.
CNN was never this bad, you know, 12, 15 years ago. And they've completely gone so far in one direction.
Hmm.
And you can decide who you want to blame, right? Because of how Trump treats people. And then Fox is way over here. And like I've always understood there's been like a concentration of ownership and how who owns companies can affect coverage and things like
Yeah,
that. But
yeah,
there's always still been like certain expectations of truth. Well, that's completely gone out the window. So be true, um, find out what the real story is, and don't be afraid to try to make a difference. But within it all, you've got to find a way to present your content to appeal to multiple platforms, right? And if you want to get into sports, in the olden days, you would go to BCIT, your final semester, you'd co-opt out. You'd wind up moving to Prince George or Dawson Creek or some tiny little place and eventually try to work your way back. You don't have to do any of that, right? Because um, being able to like whether it's on YouTube or on various social media platforms or whatever it is, there's so many other ways to get your message and your content out, and you just never know what's going to hit, right?
yeah, yeah.
Um, be true to the principles of journalism and try to find a way to present your content in a number of different platforms, but don't be a slave to those platforms, right? Where you can only do 30 seconds, right?
Okay.
Like I've got to do a hot take
Yeah,
because I've only got 30 seconds and I've got to make an impression like that. Like, don't be lazy.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Last question before you get the final word. Your time is such a premium. What is your favorite pastime?
I wish I had one. I want to eventually get into golf, but I don't think
Don't do
I
it. Don't
don't
do it.
I don't think that's going to happen until both my kids graduate. So much of my time was spent coaching that there was just no time for hobbies. And then when I gave up coaching, I thought there were certain things I was going to do, and I truly haven't done the majority of them because I've just wanted to be present for my kids and be there for everything. So I hope to develop hobbies when they're both graduated and out of the house, and hopefully I'm not old enough to, or hopefully I'm not too old to take advantage of them. It's like my pastime now is walking my dog.
Oh, I'll tell you, golf. Once you get into golf, it's so addicting that it's all consuming. I'll tell you that.
I can
But
see it,
yeah,
and I want
yeah,
the addiction. I want
yeah,
the addiction. I'm just not
yeah.
there yet.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Farhan. I want to give you the final word. Any takeaway or any piece of advice that you want to leave for our viewers?
I just think I think people should always try to be in a growth mindset and try to set goals. And the goals aren't always what you think they are. When I was younger, I thought goals were all career related, and they're not. Goals can be family related. Goals can be, when I started my own football program, and there were goals within that. And I just think that when you stop having that growth mindset, when you stop trying to learn, I think that's when you get old, right? So, like, I haven't completely taken a pause on all those things. I try to learn and set goals in different areas, but I do expect a bit of more change when my kids have graduated. But I would just encourage people to constantly be in a growth mindset and constantly set goals.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I just on behalf of all Canadians, I thank you for your time giving back to sports, particularly around youth and kids in sport. I think you have a valuable voice and extremely knowledgeable. And I hope your work continues for as long as you like, and you're willing to give back to the community once you're done at TSN. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope we get to connect again.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing these because hopefully they make a difference. I've heard a few of them, and the content is good, the messages are good, and I'm sure it's making a difference. And say hi to Dad.
I will. Thank you so much.
Take care.